Good afternoon, everyone. As we wait for people to be let into the seminar, I want to thank you all for joining us for an important and timely discussion on the Israel-Iran conflict. We have an extraordinary panel today, and I am delighted that we have such a good crowd to hear them. I'm former Congresswoman Kathy Manning. As the new board chair of Democratic Majority for Israel, I'm excited to build on DMFI's strong foundation and expand our impact on Capitol Hill to enhance the support for Israel and for pro-Israel Democrats across the country. Since Israel launched its preemptive strikes against Iran last week, DMFI has been hard at work. We have sent briefing materials to Capitol Hill, spoken to the press, and lifted up our Democratic allies on social media, conveying the vital message that Israel has a right to defend itself and to ensure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. During my 2 terms representing North Carolina's 6th Congressional District in Congress, combating anti-Semitism and supporting a strong U.S.-Israel relationship were central to my work. In my first term, I was vice chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia Committee, and last term, I was the vice-ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I also chaired the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, and I introduced the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. I am also privileged to be working alongside Brian Romick, DMFI's new president and CEO. Brian is a veteran of Capitol Hill who worked closely with pro-Israel champion Representative Steny Hoyer for more than 28 years, serving most recently as his leadership chief of staff. Throughout his career, Brian has spearheaded Representative Hoyer's efforts related to Israel, combating anti-Semitism, and other issues important to the Jewish community. You'll hear more from Brian later in the program. Before we get started, a reminder to please consider following DMFI on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and now on Blue Sky. And you can sign up for our news and updates on our website at dmfi.org. If you want to ask a question, submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. If you're watching on Facebook, you can enter it in the comments section. Now, hopefully we have everybody who has been able to enter, and I'm pleased to introduce our very distinguished speakers for today. Ambassador Dan Shapiro is currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. He was U.S. Ambassador to Israel during the Obama administration, and he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the Biden administration. Dan has held several senior policy positions in the State Department, at the National Security Council, and in Congress. He was Senior Director for the Middle East, North Africa on the National Security Council from 2009 to 2011, and he was Director for Legislative Affairs at the National Security Council from 1999 to 2001. Earlier in his career, he held senior positions with former Senators Bill Nelson and Dianne Feinstein on Capitol Hill. We are delighted to have Ambassador Shapiro with us today. Ambassador Michael Herzog is a retired Brigadier General of the Israeli Defense Forces, and he served as Israel's ambassador to the United States from 2021 until earlier this year. Ambassador Herzog began his IDF service as an infantryman in the Yom Kippur War, then joined the military's intelligence corps and rose to become the head of strategic planning for the IDF. He has worked for 4 ministers of defense and as a senior military aide and then as IDF chief of staff. Ambassador Herzog is a member of a distinguished Israeli family. His grandfather was chief rabbi of both Ireland and Israel. His father, Chaim Herzog, was a general, UN ambassador, and president, a position now so ably held by his brother, Isaac Herzog. His mother served in the Haganah as an intelligence officer and was the founder of Israel's first environmental organization. Ambassador Herzog is married to Shirin Herzog, a distinguished lawyer, and we are so honored to have Ambassador Herzog with us today. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and the director of the Correct Project on Arab-Israel Relations. David previously worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He co-authored with Ambassador Dennis Ross the book Be Strong and of Good Courage: How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. He is also an award-winning journalist who covered the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and hosts the podcast Decision Points. We are pleased to welcome David today. After we hear from our distinguished speakers, DMFI Chief Communications Officer Rachel Rosen will lead us in a Q&A session, and then Brian Romick, our new President and CEO, will have some final words to conclude this briefing. So, Ambassador Shapiro, why don't you start us off with your analysis of what's happening between Israel and Iran, and then we'll go to Ambassador Herzog and then to David Makovsky. Ambassador Shapiro, it's all yours.
Thank you, Congresswoman Manning. It's great to be with you and with Brian and my colleagues, Michael and David. And thanks everybody for joining us. I apologize for doing this from my car. I am parked, so this is safe, but this was too important a discussion to have to miss the opportunity, even though I had to be in transit. Thanks for having me. Let me say this, really important context for what we're seeing unfold right now. The war did not begin last Thursday. This is a war that has really been going on for a couple of decades. It was sometimes known as the Shadow War or the War Between the Wars. This is where Iran was operating, funding, financing, arming multiple terrorist proxy groups to conduct attacks against Israel of various kinds, to weaken Israel, to try to build toward an ultimate plan of the destruction of Israel. Israel, of course, spent many years responding to and trying to prevent those attacks. That was how this war was conducted before October 7th. Following the October 7th direct attack by Hamas, an Iranian proxy, although not necessarily with Iran's exact knowledge of the timing of that attack, Iran made some very major miscalculations. They, of course, encouraged their main proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, to get involved on October 8th, which they did for months on end, shooting rockets into northern Israel. Eventually, Israel had to decimate Hezbollah last fall. But in addition to that miscalculation, Iran made another incredible one twice. They conducted major state against state attacks with large barrages of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones, April 13th and October 1st. I was serving in the Pentagon during that time. The U.S. and a coalition helped Israel with its defense against the April 13th attack fairly successfully. Iran did it again October 1st, mostly U.S. and Israeli defense that time. But this really broke the taboo of state-on-state war, which is what really we are seeing now. Of course, Israel in a self-defensive action to ensure that the country that has attacked it twice directly, in addition to all those proxy attacks before, doesn't have the means to actually carry out its ideological fixation, which is the destruction of Israel. That's a nuclear weapon. And because Iran has continued to advance the enrichment capability, now documented by the IAEA, to have 10 bombs worth of 60% enriched uranium with the ability at a time of their choosing on very short notice to enrich that to weapons grade, and a separate process also shortening the distance dramatically to actually build a nuclear weapon, a separate process of weaponization, it reached the point where this had to be addressed. Now, there was an attempt to address it, of course, by President Trump and the Trump administration in negotiations, and those negotiations hadn't produced an outcome. After some maybe uncertainty about the U.S. position, they landed on the requirement that Iran have a zero enrichment capability, because if they have that capability, they essentially have the ability to produce nuclear weapons at a time of their choosing. It didn't succeed within the 60 days. You could argue whether or not more time should have been given to those negotiations, but given that they were progressing in their enrichment and their weaponization, even while the negotiations were going on, Israel took this action. It's clear, and I'm sure Mike will have more to say about this, Israel has had very significant successes in the early days, thanks to tremendous intelligence penetration of Iran. striking the Natanz enrichment facility, the Esfahan nuclear facilities, air defenses with smuggled drones, missile launchers, key IRGC and military intelligence and nuclear leaders and physicists and scientists. And that's very, very important. But Iran obviously is still capable of causing Israel incredible pain. They have launched these multiple barrages of ballistic missiles against Israel. They have had some get through. Israeli missile defenses are strong. They're supplemented by U.S. missile defenses with the THAAD batteries and the offshore ballistic missile defense capable destroyers and cruisers in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's a numbers game, and a barrage of 100 or so of these missiles may get through. Some of them may get through, and we've seen those tragic casualties take place over the last few nights. But what is clear is that unless the endpoint of this war is not Iran without an enrichment capability and without the ability to resume their march to a nuclear weapon when they so choose, the war really has not achieved its objectives. And if Israel were to have to stop or otherwise things be suspended with that being unfulfilled, then Iran will have an even greater motivation to try to achieve that capability. So the real key at this point is the Fordo enrichment facility. It's an underground, deeply buried target. It has generally, by analysts, been assessed to be something only the U.S. has the capability to destroy with aerial bombardment. That may be true. Israel may not have all the assets that the United States has, but it also may have surprises. Israel has been very creative, shown great ingenuity in the pager attack, in the commando raid in Syria, in smuggling the drones into Iran. I don't rule out that they have a creative, ingenious solution for Fordo that doesn't involve aerial bunker busting bombs, but we don't know. Another possibility, obviously, is that the United States would step in and participate and take that responsibility on itself. It seems pretty clear that that conversation is underway between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government. And it also seems pretty clear to me that President Trump is putting in place the assets he would need to take that action if he decides to do so. I do not believe he has decided to do so, but there is a second aircraft carrier moving toward the Middle East from Asia. There are tanker aircraft flying from the United States toward the Middle East. I'm sure there are other assets we don't see. And so the United States is putting in place the assets it would need if the president decides, which he hasn't yet, that the United States will take that strike. There's a third possibility, and then I'll end, which is that the damage that Iran has already endured, the weakening of its regime, the fact that they may even fear that their own people will take advantage of that weakening, the projected losses they would continue to face if Israel continues its strikes, and if the United States were to get involved, might serve as leverage to get Iran to concede what it has not been willing to concede until now. That is, to concede that it would return to the table with a prior concession not to end its nuclear enrichment program and to have that be fully and permanently verified. That's a possibility. I think I heard President Trump at the G7 this morning say the Iranians are reaching out. They're looking for talks. I saw some other reporting that through Qatar and Oman, they are sending messages they'd like to talk. That suggests they're under a lot of pressure, but it isn't enough just to talk. They've got to be willing, even before the talks begin, to signal and then to verify that they're prepared to do what would otherwise be done kinetically, militarily, or in other means by the destruction of the Fordo facility. So this is really critical how this ends. It must end without Iran the capability to build this weapon. Otherwise, they'll be very motivated to do so, and we'll be basically back where we have been, and this wall will have been for not to have achieved its objective. I'll pause there and happy to join questions later on.
Thank you so much, Dan. Ambassador Herzog, can you share your perspective on what Israel has achieved and where you see things going from here?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you. To begin with, I will say that what we are witnessing right now may be the final act in what started on October 7th. Dan was right in indicating that the showdown between Israel and Iran has been going for decades, but this specific war, in a way, started on October 7th, when Hamas launched its assault on Israel. Hamas was an Iranian proxy. It didn't start through a specific coordination with Iran, but soon after, the whole Iranian axis joined that war one way or another, different levels of intensity. On October 8th, Hezbollah joined, and the Houthis and Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq. And ultimately, Iran itself launched two massive missile and drone strikes against the state of Israel, something they would never do before October 7th. And they did it because they believed Israel was weaker and more vulnerable, and they could do it without any consequences. So this is a final act. And Israel has been preparing for this kind of war for decades. And the question is, why now? And I think this was born out of a unique combination of necessity and opportunity that presented itself to our decision makers. The first thing to note is that the Iranian nuclear program was getting out of hand, was getting to a very, very dangerous level. Iran essentially became a nuclear threshold state in terms of the uranium enrichment, mastering the fuel cycle, and they amassed enriched uranium to the degree that they could produce, once they make a decision to go for the bomb, 15 to 17 bombs. Only with a 60% enriched uranium, they could produce 10 bombs. If they decided to go for one bomb, it would take them maybe a week to enrich to military grades. And they blinded the inspection, and they rejected the attempts to reach a new diplomatic outcome that would block their way to a nuclear weapon. And over only a few days ago, we've seen the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, come out with a clear condemnation of Iran for its non-compliance with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. That created a necessity. We could no longer wait because this was getting out of hand. It was becoming dangerous. And most of all, we had evidence that Iran resumed its effort to advance the option of weaponization, which they have not done for a while, but now we saw that they were basically rebuilding kind of a weaponization group and advancing R&D in order to cut the time needed to create a bomb once they make that decision. On the other hand, we also launched this war in order to neutralize their strategic ballistic missile threat. We cut it significantly in our operation in Iran in October, but they were closing that gap, and they were about to break through to the ability to massively produce missiles on huge numbers, huge scale that could endanger Israel in an intolerable way. Look at what's been happening over the last few days. They've been firing hundreds of missiles at Israel. I'm now in Israel. Every night we spend hours in a bomb shelter. About 10% of their missiles penetrate the air defense system, which are not foolproof. And look at the damage they create. Now imagine Iran firing missiles at Israel, but on a much bigger scale. Imagine Iran firing missiles with a nuclear warhead. This, of course, is intolerable as far as the state of Israel is concerned, and we had to take action. On the other hand, there was a rare opportunity, unique opportunity created by the fact that during this war, over the last few months, Israel turned the table on the Iranian axis, and we basically denied Iran the basic shield it created around its strategic capabilities, its own air defenses. Hezbollah as a shield to the Iranian nuclear program. Syria failed, and subsequently we took out all the air defenses in Syria, which was also part of the shield protecting Iran's strategic capabilities. They created a unique opportunity, and that window was about to be closed by Iran. They worked very hard to close it, including to harden their nuclear facilities to the point that neither Israel nor the US could take them out. On top of that, we have seen, and I want to say a word about the coordination between Israel and the US surrounding this war. There's a lot of misreporting and misinformation surrounding this war. Reports that we're at odds and there was no understanding, and contrary reports that from the beginning, The US was scheming with us to mislead the Iranians to believe that we're not going to attack, and we kind of cheated on them and ultimately achieved surprise. I think the reality is more complex in the sense that the US wanted to give a chance to diplomacy. It gave a chance to diplomacy. It gave around 60 days. We launched our strike on day 61, as President Trump noted. And only in the last few days did the Trump administration come to the conclusion that the Iranians were not serious in the nuclear negotiations and that what they were doing in their nuclear program was real dangerous. And you couldn't let them continue that game, and gave the green light to Israel to launch this strike. Now, what Israel has been doing in this war from day one is focusing on 4 to 5 groups of targets. And I want to understand this to explain the strategic rationale behind it. The first was hitting senior defense officials. And we took out many of them, the most senior defense leadership in Iran, both in the army and the Revolutionary Guards. This created shock and awe, but also disrupted their decision-making process in terms of how they're going to respond to us. The second group was nuclear facilities, nuclear infrastructure, and scientists. This is critically important in order to push them away from weaponization. The third group was taking out their air defenses, and we are now at a point really unimaginable only a short while ago, where the skies of Iran are open to Israeli planes. We are flying them every day, a few times a day. We're talking about something over 1,000 miles away from the state of Israel. We are flying there as if this is Beirut, and we are targeting their strategic facilities in Iran, something that none of us would imagine just a while ago. And the fourth group of targets is their ballistic missiles, which are the main tool for them to inflict damage on the state of Israel or on our allies or on US targets as well. Iran started this war with around 2,000 missiles and hundreds of launchers. And we see the damage that they've been inflicting on Israel every day, every night. We are degrading that arsenal slowly but surely. The IDF just announced today that they took out about a third of the Iranian launchers. This is a real bottleneck, both mobile and fixed launchers. Will continue to do so, but they still have a considerable arsenal, and they could fire every night dozens of missiles at Israel for days to come. And this is a race between us and them, and hopefully will degrade more and more of their capabilities. Over the last 2 days, Israel also hit some of their economic targets, not full scale. We could do much more. This is an Achilles heel of Iran because most of their oil export facilities are concentrated in certain areas, and it's easy to target them. But the war just started, and it could be a long, protracted war. And I think what will decide this war are a few elements. One, our ability to degrade the missile arsenal, and two, and here I want to focus just for 2 minutes on the nuclear issue. The main goal of this campaign, it's not an operation, it's a campaign, is to neutralize, to remove the nuclear threat for years to come. So Iran cannot rebuild it, cannot reconstitute it, and continue to threaten us with the nuclear capabilities. And that is a challenge because unlike in Syria or Iraq in the past, where Israel took their nuclear programs out, this is not one reactor. It's a big program across the country. And the main challenge is to deny Iran the scenario of going underground and racing to the bomb. And for that, you have to take out the critical elements of that program. There are not many. We know where they are and what they are. And that is a big challenge. And for that, I believe that it is critical to have a full coordination between Israel and the United States. We need the US, not only operationally, we have fantastic operation capabilities, but the US has, of course, as a superpower, much more to offer, but also in terms of kind of navigating the right exit strategy from this war, and most important, the day after, making sure that Iran will be unable to go back and reconstruct its program. And that's something that Israel cannot shoulder alone. It needs the United States. As I understand it, talking to people in the US administration, there's a debate going on to what extent the US should scale up its participation in this war beyond what it's currently doing, which is political support for Israel, helping us in defense. As Dan noted, there are THAAD batteries here in Israel, helping our defenses, sharing intelligence, and so on. But will the US regard this war not only as an interest of individual interest of Israel, but an interest of the US and the free world as a whole to get rid of the Iranian nuclear program? That's still an open question. We have to wait and see. But what we have achieved until now is unbelievable, but the challenge is ahead. And hopefully, together with the United States, we'll complete the job and make sure that our region and the world are a safer place.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Herzog. It's really inspiring to hear what the Israelis have been able to achieve so far. David, I believe you're joining us from Amman, Jordan, so you must have a very interesting perspective on what is going on. So can you add to what our other panelists have shared and perhaps add the perspective of Israel's neighbors?
Yeah, well, it's good to be with all of you. And I would just say it's hard following Dan and Mike as they covered a lot of ground. And so I think I'll change my presentation and focus a little elsewhere about what are these next couple weeks going to look like? I mean, what are the variables? Where and yes, I did have meetings with senior Arab officials. But I think we need to know about, what are the things we should be looking for? And I think in many ways, this is, I'll just add before looking ahead, I would add one thing. The war of the last year, very much, Mike said it about, the October 7th dimension. I think it's clear that part of this is also, the two achievements of Israel in the last year were the decapitation of Hezbollah. That was supposed to be the insurance policy for Iran. If Israel won't dare hit Iran, if they know that Hezbollah can hit Israel. The idea that Hezbollah leaders are putting out the word, we are staying out of this fight, is mind-blowing. I mean, tens of billions of dollars Iran has invested in Hezbollah for this one reason. So if there's a war, Hezbollah is an insurance policy. And so while I think the timing is true, driven by threat, as Mike and Dan said, I think it's also driven by opportunity, that there is Hezbollah is a shell of what it was. Doesn't mean it doesn't have any power, but I mean, to know that we're at this place, that Hezbollah would stay out of the war, which was the reason why Iran put it there in the first place, is if you follow this issue at all for the last 30 years, this is just mind-blowing. And the other element, and some of you know I can't resist sports analogies, is, by Israel taking out the S-300s of Russia, and Russia needing all of its air defenses because of the war in Ukraine, suddenly, Israel is like facing a hockey team that doesn't have a goalie. The net is wide open. As Mike said, this is an amazing moment of time that Israel has air dominance completely over the skies of Tehran. A joke going around on the internet is, there's nothing flying out of Israel except for direct flights between Israel and Tehran these days. So I think opportunity no less than threat, but when you add the two together and the timing, the 60th day, as Trump said, we're not going to get in your frame, Mr. President. And then the Board of Governors decision in Vienna of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that Israel could check two boxes to say, okay, you had your 60 days. And for the first time in many years, the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors is censuring Iran for non-compliance. I think some of these things and then all the developments that Mike and Dan talked about threats. Now, what does it depend on going forward? And I think in many ways it's a fight for where's Trump and who's going to make a mistake that could tip the balance in these next 2 weeks. It's clear that one thing that could tip the balance is if the U.S. would enter the war. And I think the fact that Iran has not hit Gulf oil fields, even though Israel did hit a gas field of Iran, when they were threatening, if we're hit, our energy will hit the Gulf. They didn't lash out. Why haven't they done it? I mean, doesn't mean they can't do it, but the fact that they didn't do it, I think, says they want to keep America out of the war. And they fear, I think, that if you start going after energy in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the like, that will guarantee the U.S. will intervene, and Iran wants to keep the U.S. out of the war. So sometimes the news, Kathy, is what doesn't happen, not just what happens. And the fact that Iran has not acted that way means they want to keep Israel out. Now, it's clear, as Mike suggested, is what is going to be the level of U.S. intervention. Dan mentioned, the Nimitz and joining the Carl Vinson and 2 aircraft carriers. But for the most part, the U.S. is not focusing like it did in the Biden, would just like send whatever you got, just send. I talked to a senior U.S. official today who said all the messaging inside the government is, we're not part of any offensive operations. I think the fact that Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, didn't come to Israel before the war, they didn't want anything that could be construed by the Iranians as nothing that's offensive. But even the defense, it would be nice if there would be more optics on stuff coming into Israel. And right now, that's very low profile, if it is at all. So I think this fear of the U.S. of not being seen as too close to Israel at this time is an important point. Yes, Trump did say excellent to a Fox News interview on Friday about the Israeli strike. And sometimes I think when he says, well, sometimes you got to let the sides fight, is almost as if he thinks, well, maybe they'll have some limited strikes and that'll tip Iran coming back to the negotiating table. So the question is, if the U.S. doesn't join, one big question, if it doesn't join the fight, can indeed Israel, really take Fordo on its own? This is like I don't know, close to 100 yards deep of rock and hardened facilities. And we don't think Israel could do it. And Dan is right that Israel's been ingenious in so many ways, getting Mossad people in to fire drones within Iran and keeping in the tradition of the beepers and all these other things. So you can't count Israel out ever. That there are maybe have creative ways like hitting the electricity that they've already seemed to have done around Fordo, but it's not the same as demolishing the site. So if the U.S. joins, it could demolish Fordo. But what if the U.S. doesn't join? It cannot demolish Fordo. And then the question is can Israel do it on its own? So what I keep wondering is when I think of analogies, I'm thinking of, is this 1973 in the sense that, then no one thought the U.S. would join the war. There was a focus on airlift, but it became an issue of time. And Kissinger at a certain point was offering Israel, how much time do you need? But at some point, Kissinger did, a Security Council resolution with Moscow, behind Israel's back. So I don't know if there's a time clock that Israel has. I mean, I've been looking also like at Israel TV and on, in Hebrew, and it seems that the backgrounding today is this thing will go on for another 2 weeks. But of course, the other side has a vote. You don't have a veto on that. That was one of the things that came out today. Another thing that came out today was what Mike said about a third of the launchers have been hit. So if I'm looking at this war, I'm trying to think if it's indeed 2 weeks ahead, who's going to use the 2 weeks wisest? I think what Iran is hoping for is Israel makes a mistake on the battlefield, that it hits hospitals and that it creates an outrage so much in the international system to put pressure on Trump. I think that might be one approach. Who makes the biggest mistake in the next 2 weeks? Another question is if the U.S. doesn't join, is how does Israel believe, and I tend to think Israel believes like this because it doesn't trust the negotiations, is whatever is not achieved on the battlefield will not be achieved at the negotiating table. So even if you can't get Fordo, can you do so many other things around it? And I agree with Mike. I mean, the four areas I would have listed would have been the nuclear, ballistic missiles, the launchers, and the seniors, meaning going after the military, going after the scientists. Those are the four categories you're looking at. So, how do you use these 2 weeks? And I'm sorry to get a little technical. Does Israel have enough arrow interceptors? Does Iran increase the frequency and the lethality of its strikes at night? Or did they start with, firing 100 a night, and now tonight they did 10, but maybe they'll do some later? I mean, there's a danger of being into the micro too much because, things could change. But I wonder if this is a race against time, that Israel, on one hand, is going on offense, but it's going on defense as it goes on offense. Does it have enough arrows in these next 2 weeks if America is not in the fight? And I worry that these next 2 weeks, Israel's going to say, whatever we don't lock in on, we set the reality by what we achieve on the battlefield. Tzachi Hanegbi, the National Security Advisor, did say on his own interview that I've seen, which was on Channel 12, he said this will not be solved militarily. This will be solved politically. And if that is really the view, that Israel is not out for regime change, he was asked, he said no. Although it's interesting that Trump, I think the Wall Street Journal, his people said, we vetoed Israel killing Khomeini. That might be America's way of signaling to Iran, hey, we're saving you, but you better come to the table. And so I guess just to summarize, who uses the next 2 weeks best? Clearly, if the U.S. joins the Israelis on offense, game over. Game over. Then Fordo is hit, and but what if Plan A doesn't work? Can Israel Plan B get rid of the Fordo enrichment plant? If it can't, can it do enough damage with all these surrounding things connected to the nuclear program? We're heard that the prime minister says there's still dozens of targets to go. So can Israel achieve its goals on offense? But I worry the defense, like enough arrow interceptors, is really with a third of the launchers gone. Is it clear that Iran's ability to inflict damage on the homeland in Israel less and less over time, or is it more and more over time? So how these next 2 weeks play out, I think, will affect the cards at the negotiating table, because I do think that's what each one is trying to maximize their position, assuming they will get back to that table. I can go on and on. Why don't I just stop there for now?
Thank you so much, David and Ambassador Herzog and Ambassador Shapiro. I'm very pleased to begin the Q&A portion of our discussion. And if you have a question, please put it in the chat feature if you're with us on Zoom. Otherwise, if you're on social media, you can put it into the comment section. I want to go to Ambassador Shapiro for the first question and touch on something that David talked about, which is the U.S. role since Israel launched preemptive strikes in Iran. Ambassador Shapiro, what is your sense of what the U.S. role has been, and should the U.S. be doing more?
Thanks, Rachel. I agree with David that the U.S. is providing assistance to the defense of Israel. We have the two THAAD batteries. We have the offshore ballistic missile destroyers, and I believe more on the way. And this is consistent with how the U.S. acted in the two attacks by Iran last year in April and October. I don't know if the U.S. was involved in the first night of downing the drones that were sent. There were about 100 fired, and mostly the Israeli Air Force downed them. It's conceivable that there was U.S. Air Force participation there, and maybe even a couple of other countries as well. But it wasn't the same coalition as last April. It's interesting, and David mentioned this as well, that for various reasons or whatever reason, the administration has chosen not to be very outspoken and not to make clear publicly that we are providing that very assistance to defend Israel. I think it's something to be proud of. They may feel that even their involvement in that defensive activity could become a rationale or an excuse for Iran to target U.S. forces, and they're trying to create give Iran no reason to do that. So that's, I think, been the main contribution so far. As I mentioned, my assessment is, and this hasn't been announced, but my assessment is based on the forces that we know are flowing to the region, the second aircraft carrier and the tankers, and I assume there are others that are made less visible, that CENTCOM is putting in place the forces that they would need if the president makes a decision to go on offense. Now, that's a big decision. I don't believe he's made it. I believe it's a divided point within the administration. I believe they have legitimate concern about Iranian retaliation against U.S. forces in the Gulf, maybe against other U.S. partners in the Gulf, maybe against oil shipments or mining the Strait of Hormuz. There are a lot of bad things Iran can do in retaliation, and there may be ways you can mitigate that by making clear to Iran the price they would pay, even above and beyond, let's say, the Fordo facility, if they were to take those activities. But those have to be taken into account. So at the moment, I think it remains defensive, certainly resupply to Israel for the munitions it needs. But the big question is still an unsettled question about whether the United States, if needed, would use its military power directly to help make sure Iran has no enrichment, or at least threaten it in such a way that you leverage that to get Iran to make the concessions that we need them to make.
Thanks, Ambassador Shapiro. Ambassador Herzog, I wanted to ask you about Israeli sentiment. How is morale? Can you talk about some of the damage that Israel has suffered with Iranian strikes?
So, as I said, I'm here in Israel and spent the last few nights in a bomb shelter for quite a few hours. We've been hit hard, but our society is very resilient. First thing to note is that there is consensus in Israel about this war. Unlike other crises and wars where our society was divided, here I think there's a solid consensus behind this war. People understand the need to go after Iran. People perceive Iran as an existential threat to the state of Israel that has to be removed, that has to be dealt with. And people really support what's happening, and we are paying a price, like in every war. The damage is considerable because the Iranians are sending missiles with very heavy payloads, hundreds of kilos. And as I noted, our air defenses are not foolproof. We have a success rate of about 90%, which is very high. But the 10% that infiltrate, let's say they fire 40 missiles, 4 penetrate, each with a warhead of several hundred kilos, that inflicts heavy damage. People follow the instructions of the home front command, and those who stay in shelter are usually safe. Only direct hits on shelters can really cause damage and endanger lives, but those who stay in shelters are usually safe. And our society is resilient, and hopefully this will not go for long. I wouldn't be fixated on a time frame of 2 weeks, as was mentioned. I think nobody can predict how long this war is going to take. We all know how you start a war. We never know how the war ends. It could be a protracted one. There is a race between our capabilities and their capabilities to inflict damage on Israel, and between our ability to grade their capabilities and what they do in the meantime. But what we have achieved so far gives me a lot of hope. And the fact that we control the skies of Iran is a real game changer. And if we manage to really degrade their missile capacity, and we have the political time to operate, then we can take our time and achieve our goals.
Thank you, Ambassador. David, I have a question from you, from Lisa. Can you speak to the other countries in the region, especially Abraham Accords countries, Jordan and Egypt, and their posture and role in the current conflict?
Look, different countries have different positions. I think right now, many of them, they have, issued their condemnations, but they're so pro forma, it's kind of baked into the cake. Someone said these kind of pro forma condemnations is almost like a standing ovation for the state of Israel, that everyone knows that they have to condemn. I'm not sure with the Gulf states. I think they're really nervous that Iran might hit their oil fields, and they don't even have 12 minutes to get into a bomb shelter like in Israel. They're much closer to Iran, and they're more vulnerable. They don't have the Israeli Air Force and the like. So I do think with them, they truly want to. They want this somehow to be worked out. They have no illusions who Iran is. They understand how dangerous the regime is, but I think their vulnerabilities drive everything. So I think they see it differently. And now it is interesting, like for example, the Europeans, are really they're not really, no one's running to the Security Council against Israel. This is not like Gaza war right now. To be fair, also in the first weeks of the Gaza war, people understood it was more support. I do fear that protracted wars where more mistakes are and casualties mount and mistakes happen with civilians, Israel will feel more pressure. And that's why in every war until October 7th, Israel has felt this fear of what they call in Hebrew the Sha'on Medini, the diplomatic clock, that Israel has limited time and Israel needs short wars. And I don't know, October 7th made us believe that the law of political physics has been suspended and it doesn't matter anymore. I'm not sure the laws of physics political physics have been suspended. So I agree with Mike that it should be mission driven, but I'm not sure that that will be the case. And what Dan said, I very much identify with, about we as America should use our leverage. I mean, what Iran does not want is a war with the United States at all costs. And I think this Iranian fear of America is something should be used by the president, who likes the image of being a tough guy, to somehow say, you don't want to mess with us? Well, these are the new rules. And yes, I offered this in the Witkoff talks then, but that was then and this is now. And the price has gone up for Iran as its capacity has been diminished. So I'm concerned that in the that and I'm not trying to call on the DMFI to do anything, but I am concerned that I don't see the mobilization yet in the United States, but maybe I'm in the Arab world, so it's going on and I just don't see it. But I don't see the mobilization in Israel, in America, for saying, hey, maybe we do need certain things that tell the Iranians that don't mistake where the U.S. stands in this war. Be more out there, at least on the defensive side. If you can't be out there on offensive resupply, or you're not going to join the war. But it should be clear to the Iranians that that they are weaker than they've ever been in decades, and the U.S. needs to convey that in an unmistakable way, that these talks are just not going to pick up where they were, before these Israeli strikes attacked. And the way I read it, and maybe I'm being too much of a pessimist, but I see the Israelis saying, we don't have all the time in the world. We got to be fatalist about it. But whatever we don't do on the battleground doesn't get done at the negotiating table. So let's just use the time as wisely as we can, knowing that at some point, the U.S. is going to pull the plug and we become less reliant on America. But I would just like to see Washington be more assertive with the Iranians. And that doesn't really come across here, that the U.S. is assertive and using its leverage, because Iran fears a direct confrontation with the United States.
Thanks, David. Ambassador Shapiro, I'm curious as to what you think of the political response to the conflict so far. I can share a DMFI. We've been lifting up statements that convey the need for Israel to defend itself, and that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. We've been sharing them across social media and with allies. What's been your assessment of how Democrats have responded?
I think there's been a range of responses, and some are articulating the position you just stated of Israel's right to conduct this and the need to ensure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. Others had hoped that diplomacy would be successful. I think we all hope that diplomacy can solve these problems. There's a lot of rehearsing of history. Of course, everyone knows the long history of the 2015 agreement, the JCPOA, and then President Trump's withdrawal from the agreement in 2018. I frankly am not very interested in that history at this point. I think the thing that everyone should be focused on is the outcome. And so the outcome of ensuring that going forward, Iran, perhaps even newly motivated because of how badly they've been hurt, to acquire that nuclear capability and the deterrent they think it might provide them, but also the offensive capability to provide them, is really what we should be focused on. There's different and legitimate views about the right way to go about that. I think overall there's pretty good support. As I think was mentioned, there hasn't been some a rush to the Security Council or some outcry calling on Israel to stop. I think even the Europeans have been fairly supportive of what Israel's doing. So I just think it's important that as this debate unfold in the days and maybe a few weeks ahead, what the focus is the outcome. And ensuring that after all of this diplomacy and military action and the costs, everybody, Iranians, Israelis, are paying for it, that we don't end up more or less back to the same place we were with Iran as a nuclear threshold state threatening to break out anytime they wish. With apologies, I'm going to have to sign off now.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador Shapiro. Grateful to have you with us today. Ambassador Herzog, I have a question for you from David. What is your sense of how Iranian civilians are feeling in this moment?
So it's an interesting question. I would say up until the war, I was following very closely the internal developments inside Iran. My conclusion was that the majority of the Iranians were not siding with the regime. The regime lost the population. There was a real divide there. Since the war broke out, we see mixed reactions in Iran, but we see quite a bit expressions of support for what Israel is doing, even encouragement to Israel to do more. I saw today a billboard calling on Israel to take out Khamenei, written by an Iranian inside Iran. There's a lot of that. We have to be careful the way we operate so as not to get the people aligned behind the regime, but rather deepen that divide. We have said time and again that this is not a war against the Iranian people, but only against this specific regime. Regime change is not a stated goal of this operation, and it cannot be, because you cannot change a regime only with your air force. It's not a feasible proposition, but it could be one of the outcomes ultimately. Cause kind of a chain reaction. And I do believe that if the regime feels threatened by what we are doing, maybe it could ultimately prompt the regime to go back to the negotiating table and go for a diplomatic exit to this war, because they don't want to endanger their own survivability and continue that war. But the way I look at the internal reactions in Iran, I see people are under duress. Many people are leaving Tehran, but I see a lot of expressions of people who are happy about what we are doing and want to see the regime gone.
Thank you, Ambassador. David, I'm getting a number of questions about the sort of timeline. How much time do you think there is for Israel to try and achieve its goals here?
That's the big question. I think this is like a $64,000 question, and that's why I'm wondering if we think after October 7th there's no time constraints, or all the other wars there is. And I certainly, what we saw with October 7th, the world was with Israel in the beginning, and then the world wasn't with Israel as the human toll mounted. Now, I think the Israeli Air Force is incredible, and they're going after military targets. They're going after, like I said, the military leadership, the nuclear scientists, the nuclear infrastructure, the ballistic missiles, and the launchers. Those are the four sets of targets, and I think Israel's going to try to avoid civilian targets wherever possible. What I worry about are mistakes, that somehow when you do so many hundreds and hundreds of sorties, there is a mistake. And that's what Iran wants to pounce. And that's why I think, these next couple weeks are crucial. Who avoids mistakes best? To me, that is the best. And I would hope, Mike was right that maybe it's more of an open-ended situation. Clearly, if the U.S. comes in, it could be a very short thing because they would go right for Fordo, and that's where I think the crown jewel is. Even though Natanz enriches more than Fordo does, but that's the hardest target. So, but I think you have to assume like a worst case scenario. You can't assume a best case scenario. You have to assume your time is limited. And if you're wrong, be pleasantly wrong, surprised on the upside that you have more time. But don't assume that you do, because there could be these mistakes. And, I just wish the U.S. would leverage the Iranian fear of the U.S. to try to restart these negotiations from a very different place. I come back to Hanegbi. Hanegbi just said there's no military solution. It's got to end. The end game has got to be political with Trump. So I really hope the U.S. and Israel are synchronized here in terms of timeline, in terms of objectives, on how to really translate stunning battlefield successes of Israel into enduring strategic achievements. Or else I think there will be a sense of deep bitterness in Israel that, having achieved all this, and what do we have to show for it? So to me, this is a call for very tight U.S.-Israel coordination and some real shrewd sense of how to translate Israeli successes into a deal. I mean, this is the one moment in time, if I could use it, I was not always in agreement with James Baker, but I wish we had a Baker-like approach, a very tough-minded American leadership to use the leverage of what Israel's achieved in order to make sure that you could lock in something at the table. It's not enough, of course, to lock it in at the table. It has to be enforceable over time. And for Iran to say, well, maybe we won't enrich for 3 years. I mean, that's so transparent. They just want to tell Trump, don't worry, it won't happen during your watch. But that's clearly not enough by any stretch. So it's got to be, this is a time for American leadership to be front and center.
Thank you so much, David and Ambassador Herzog and Ambassador Shapiro. We're so grateful to have had you join us today. I'm very excited to turn it over now to our new president and CEO, Brian Romick, to close us out of the event.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I also want to thank Ambassador Herzog, Ambassador Shapiro, and David Makowski for taking the time out of their schedules to join us for this discussion today. I think they all made clear that we need to make sure no matter how this conflict ends, Iran can't have nuclear weapon capability, and DMFI will continue to advocate for that outcome. I'm excited to have recently stepped into the role as president and CEO of the Democratic Majority for Israel. I'm looking forward to building on DMFI's strong foundation and expand its impact, particularly on Capitol Hill, where I spent more than 28 years. During my time on the Hill, I worked closely with pro-Israel champion Congressman Steny Hoyer, serving most recently as his leadership chief of staff. Throughout my career, I oversaw Congressman Hoyer's efforts related to Israel, combating anti-Semitism, and other issues important to the Jewish community. Watching the events unfold between Israel and Iran have filled us all with a mix of resolve and stress. At DMFI, we have been working to share messaging materials with the Hill, statements with the press, and elevating social media messages conveying that Israel has a right to defend itself and to ensure that Iran does not get nuclear weapons capability. Israel is doing what it needs to do to keep the country and the world safe, but that does not make our work in the Democratic Party. But that does make our work in the Democratic Party even more urgent and crucial. Our job is to make sure that Democratic office holders, leadership, and activists understand a complicated set of events like this. We could not be doing this without your support. Your involvement with DMFI helps keep the Democratic Party pro-Israel and strengthens the U.S.-Israel relationship. We are deeply grateful. Do you have a friend you can recruit to support the work of DMFI? Have you made your gift to DMFI yet for 2025? If you'd like to donate today, please help support our vital work and future events. Please scan the QR code to help support us or visit our website. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll keep scheduling these briefings as the situation develops. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.